So why is rental control a joke? And why is it unfair? So the scream at the moment is that it's unfair that rents are increasing the way they are. Well, I think first of all, we need to differentiate between unfair and unpleasant. I'm not disagreeing that it's unpleasant, but unfair is a completely different thing. Because if we were to switch the tables and say, all right, well, if it's unfair for rental prices to go up, then we'd have to say that it's unfair for ownership costs to go up. But that's just a fact of life, just as is rental increases. We're dealing with a free market. So unless we want to move to the communist end and control everything, which the experiment's been done and it proved it didn't work, then free market needs to be dealt with. And then that leads us to the question as to why do we have high rents? Okay, good question. Why do we have high rents? We have high rents because there is not enough rental properties and we have way more renters than there are properties. So in order to solve that problem, there's three solutions really. We can either reduce the number of renters, or we can increase the number of rental properties, or we can do both. A combination, I would suggest, is probably the best solution here. Now, how do we reduce the number of renters? Well, the only way I can think of that is, obviously humane, is to increase the number of increase the number of renters that become homeowners. So for those of you who are renters that don't like the lack of control of renting, the question for you is, how do you increase your wealth so you can become a property owner? Because one of the things you give up when you are a renter, and I was a renter for a long time, is control. And I hated it. I absolutely hated the lack of control that I had as a renter. I did it for a while because it kept my cost of living for the short term low, and I invested my money into my business and growing my property portfolio. But it sucked for quite a long time. I hated it. I had properties that I couldn't put picture hooks in. I couldn't paint them the way I wanted them. The landlords didn't do the maintenance well. It wasn't fun, okay? But that was the trade-off, is I got cheaper living for the time compared to ownership, but I gave up control. So those are our options for how to solve the issue, is we either increase supply or we reduce demand. Okay, so what happens if we do reduce the rents? If we force rents to reduce? Well, again, this comes back to basic economics. If we force the rents to stay low, if we force them to be on hold and ownership costs keep rising, or even just the return for the investors is less, well, then it's less interesting for people to own investment properties, which then reduces the supply even more. So then that imbalance goes even more this way. So ultimately we'll again end up with higher rental prices. Okay, so if we reduce supply, we drive prices up even further. And then some of you would argue, oh, but no, the government will control the rental prices. Well, there's no free lunch. If the rental prices are being controlled, someone is picking up the difference somewhere. If that's the government, they're doing it with tax dollars, which means they need to fund it, which means we need to pay more tax. So you're still paying for it regardless. The only way to deal with this is actually solve the core problem, not stick band-aids on it and do political stunts like freezing rents for, saying landlords can only increase rents every 12 months instead of every 6 months. That's done nothing. It's done absolutely nothing. All that's done now is, because there's still this huge undersupply, is now landlords are going, well, geez, I can't increase my rents for the next 12 months, so I'll have to do a bigger jump this time because I don't know what's happening with interest rates or construction costs or maintenance costs or whatever. So it hasn't done anything apart from appease some people that are voting for that quick fix instead of fixing the underlying issue, which is the supply. So the next thing too is, I think landlord throws a very unfair slant on this, or at least it colours the picture in a very strange way, in that when you say landlord, you think of this really super rich, wealthy person living in this opulent life with fast cars, and I think of Downton Abbey, the landlord sitting in his castle. So we still use the word landlord, but what is the typical landlord in Australia? I'm glad you asked. Let's have a look at that. So most investment properties are owned by the private sector. So they are owned by private individuals. So if we want to increase the supply, we want more rental properties, let's have a look at who's actually providing the rental properties. Okay, let's have a look. So the ATO did a study and they had a look at who are the people owning our properties. Well, 25% is owned by what they call next generation, and that's effectively the younger group. So they are certainly the smallest portion, and good on them for getting in early and being disciplined and saving money and getting an investment property. Then retirees were the next smallest at 26%. Now, that's pretty telling that our retirees are 26%, which explains a lot about why we have so many on the age pension. And then our wealth accumulators, so people in that middle section of life, is at 42%. So basically that middle age group, and it is broken down further in a study from CoreLogic, which is the ages 50 to 64 are the most likely to own an investment property. So, if that took them until they're 50 to buy an investment property, I'm making a guess that they're not super rich. Not to mention that CoreLogic study also showed that the taxable income of most property investors is between 60 to 80,000. Again, not the super wealthy. So really, if your argument is that we should have rental control, what you're suggesting, and based on this, is that it's normally 50 to 64-year-olds and they earn between 60 to 80,000, which is around the average wage in Australia. What you're suggesting is that you are comfortable going next door to your neighbour or the person across the road or your cousin or your uncle or your auntie that fits into that group and going, subsidise my living, pay me $100 a week for rent. That's what you're doing. Now, there is an intermediary when the government's doing it, which is great because it adds more cost to the bottom line, because then they need to put a government department in charge of controlling that, which costs more tax dollars, which pushes taxes further up, so everyone's paying for it. But that's ultimately what you're suggesting you're comfortable doing, is walking up to one of those average Australian people and saying, you need to subsidise my rent. Hey, I know your interest costs went through the roof and you've just come off your fixed loan and you're barely making ends meet, but you need to now subsidise my living. That was something that was given up when you chose to rent, was that element of control. Okay, and same as in property ownership, you don't control everything. You don't control the interest rates. So none of that bickering between landlords, we'll call it the average Australian that actually owns a property versus the average Australian who doesn't own a property, these two sides bickering against each other isn't solving the problem, and it won't. Any forced solution there will actually just make the problem more long-term. The only way to solve this is increase the supply or reduce the demand. And bottom line is there's a lot of red tape in the way and a lot of things discouraging investors getting into the market and being a landlord. So, all right, what's the government up to? Because the problem's getting worse, and throwing these vote buys or buying votes by doing these political stunts of saying, oh, we're going to control rents for 12 months or reduce the amount landlords can increase. Yeah, it's not fixing the problem. It's absolutely not fixing the problem. It's driving up costs, and ultimately it's going to make rent even more or even less affordable. So sorry to burst the bubble, but unless you're willing to walk next door and demand your neighbour pays for your rent, then you're actually not for rental control either. Hope that sheds some light on it for a few of you. If you found that interesting, throw some comments. If you hated what I said and it really made your blood boil, throw some comments in. Love to see it. But again, ask the question, do you disagree about, is it unfair or is it unpleasant? I don't disagree, it's unpleasant. I really don't. But there's a big difference between unpleasant and unfair. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.